My sister stood beside me on my wedding day, wearing a dress that looked almost exactly like mine. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what she did 5 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle. She took the microphone, smiled at my 200 guests, and announced something that turned my dream wedding into a nightmare. She thought she had ruined my life. She had no idea I'd already discovered her secret. And before that night was over, every single person in that room would know the truth. My name is Emily Carter. I was 29 years old when I married the man I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. His name was Daniel. We'd been together for almost 4 years. Daniel wasn't perfect, but he was kind, patient, and the person I trusted most in the world. At least, that's what I believed. My wedding day was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The venue was a beautiful country estate outside Nashville, Tennessee. There were white flowers everywhere, and 200 guests had traveled from different states to celebrate with us. My parents were sitting in the front row. My best friends were crying before the ceremony had even started, and my older sister, Jessica, was supposed to be my maid of honor. Jessica and I had never been particularly close. Growing up, she was always the more confident one. She was prettier, more outgoing, more successful, and somehow, whenever something good happened to me, Jessica found a way to make it about herself. When I got promoted at work, she told everyone she could have gotten the same job if she'd wanted it. When I bought my first house, she laughed and called it a starter box. And when Daniel proposed, she hugged me and whispered something I'll never forget. "Let's see how long this one lasts." I thought she was joking. I was wrong. On the morning of my wedding, everything seemed perfect. My hair was done, my dress was hanging beside the window, and my bridesmaids were taking pictures. Then Jessica walked into my room. She was wearing a champagne-colored bridesmaid dress. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Then I noticed the details. The same lace pattern, the same pearl belt, even the same hairstyle I'd chosen for myself. I stared at her and asked, "Jessica, why are you dressed like that?" She smiled and said, "Like what?" I told her, "Like the bride." She laughed and said, "Don't be so dramatic, Emily." I wanted to argue, but it was my wedding day. I didn't want to start a fight, so I let it go. That was my first mistake. About 20 minutes later, my mother came into the room looking nervous. She asked me to come outside for a minute, so I followed her into the hallway. She lowered her voice and said, "There's something you should know." I asked what she meant. She looked toward Jessica's room and told me that my sister had been acting strange all morning. I almost laughed and said, "Mom, that's not exactly breaking news." But my mother didn't smile. She told me Jessica had been asking Daniel's friends a lot of questions. My stomach tightened. I asked what kind of questions, but before Mom could answer, we heard Jessica shouting from downstairs. Then there was silence. I looked at my mother and she looked at me. Somehow, I knew my wedding day was about to become something completely different. When I finally walked toward the ceremony, I forced myself to smile. 200 people turned toward me. My father held my arm, Daniel stood at the altar, and for a few seconds everything else disappeared. I looked at him and he smiled. I smiled back. I thought, this is it. But then I noticed Jessica. She wasn't sitting with the bridal party. She was standing near the reception area holding a phone, and she was watching Daniel. Not me, Daniel. The ceremony continued. We exchanged vows, exchanged rings, and kissed. Everyone applauded. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined everything. Maybe Jessica was just being Jessica. Maybe I was overthinking it. Then came the reception, and that's when she made her move. The room was filled with laughter. People were eating dinner, music was playing, my father gave a beautiful speech, and Daniel's mother cried during hers. Then it was time for my sister to give the maid of honor speech. Jessica walked toward the microphone. I smiled because I expected something embarrassing, maybe an old childhood story. Instead, she looked directly at Daniel, then looked at me and said, "Emily, you've always wanted the perfect life." The room became quiet. I laughed nervously and told her, "Jessica, please don't embarrass me." She smiled and said, "Oh, I think it's too late for that." Daniel's face changed. I noticed immediately. He looked scared, not annoyed, not confused, scared. Jessica continued and said, "You deserve to know what your husband has been doing behind your back." My heart stopped. Daniel stood up and said, "Jessica, don't." That one sentence changed everything. I looked at him and asked, "Don't what?" He didn't answer. Jessica raised her phone and said, "I have proof." Suddenly, 200 people were staring at us. My father stood up and told Jessica to sit down, but she ignored him. She looked at me and said, "Daniel has been cheating on you." The room exploded. My mother covered her mouth, my best friend stood up, someone dropped a glass, and I couldn't move. Daniel walked toward me and said, "Emily, please let me explain." I stared at him and asked, "Is it true?" He didn't answer. That was enough. My sister smiled. She thought she'd won. But she didn't know one thing I already knew. 3 weeks before the wedding, I'd received an anonymous email. There were screenshots attached showing messages between Daniel and another woman. At first, I thought they were fake. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The woman wasn't a stranger. She was Jessica's best friend, Amanda. I confronted Daniel, and he swore nothing physical had happened. He said the messages were taken out of context. I didn't believe him, but I didn't cancel the wedding either. Instead, I started investigating. That's when I discovered something much worse. Daniel wasn't the only person lying to me. Jessica had known about the affair for months. In fact, she had been helping Daniel hide it. I found hotel receipts, deleted messages, bank transfers, and finally, something that changed everything. Jessica wasn't exposing Daniel because she cared about me. She was exposing him because Daniel had refused to leave me for her. Yes, my sister wanted my husband, and when he refused to choose her, she decided to destroy both of us. But there was still one secret I hadn't told anyone. I had proof. I looked at Jessica, then at Daniel, and then at the 200 people staring at us. Jessica held up her phone and said, "Tell them, Daniel." Daniel looked at me and said, "Emily, I made mistakes." I nodded slowly and asked, "Mistakes?" He lowered his head. Jessica interrupted and said, "He cheated on you. Everyone deserves to know." I looked at her and said, "You're right." She froze. "What?" she asked. I smiled and said, "Everyone does deserve to know." Then I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I connected my phone to the venue's projector. My wedding photographer had been using it earlier for a slideshow. I pressed one button and the screen behind us lit up. The first screenshot appeared. It was a message from Jessica to Daniel that said, "She still doesn't suspect anything." The room went silent. I changed the image and another message appeared. "Just wait until after the wedding. Once she trusts you completely, she'll never recover." Someone gasped. Jessica's face turned white. I showed another screenshot, then another, then another. Messages, photos, hotel reservations, and finally a voice recording. Jessica's own voice filled the room. She was laughing, she was talking about me, she was talking about Daniel, and she was explaining exactly why she wanted my marriage destroyed. The room was completely silent. Jessica stared at the screen and screamed, "Turn IT off." I didn't. She ran toward the projector, but my father stepped between us. He looked at her and said, "Don't you dare touch my daughter." Jessica stopped. For the first time in my life, she looked powerless. Daniel turned toward Jessica and asked, "You told me you didn't know anything about Amanda." Jessica stared at him and said, "I was trying to help Emily." I shook my head. "No," I said. "You weren't trying to help me, you wanted Daniel." Her face changed. Daniel stepped backward and asked, "What?" Jessica started crying and begged me to stop. But I refused. I told everyone that she wanted my husband, and when he wouldn't leave me, she decided to destroy my wedding. Daniel looked at her and asked, "Is that true?" Jessica said nothing, and that silence told him everything. But there was one final piece of information. I looked at Daniel and said, "There's something you should know too." He looked confused. I pulled out another document. It was a copy of a bank transfer. Daniel had been sending money to Jessica for months, not Amanda, Jessica. The hotel reservations were also under Jessica's name. Daniel wasn't simply cheating. He had been secretly helping my sister financially. The two of them had been planning something. They wanted me gone, and they thought my family would take their side. They were wrong. I didn't scream, I didn't throw anything, I didn't slap anyone. I simply looked at my sister and said, "You wanted to steal my wedding." She stared at me. "So I'm giving you exactly what you wanted." She looked confused. I pointed toward the microphone and said, "You wanted everyone's attention." Then I looked around the room and said, "Now you have it." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. My mother was crying. My father looked heartbroken. My aunt had already walked out. And Daniel, he took off his wedding ring and placed it on the table. Then he walked away. Jessica followed him, but before she reached the door, my father said something that stopped her. "Don't come back." Jessica turned around and said, "Dad," but he shook his head. "No, you didn't just hurt Emily. You humiliated our entire family." Jessica started crying, but this time nobody went after her. Nobody comforted her. Nobody defended her. She had spent years trying to make sure she was the center of attention. That night, she finally got what she wanted. Everyone was looking at her, but nobody admired her. I never married Daniel that night. The wedding was canceled. The flowers were removed, the cake was never cut, and the dress I had spent months choosing went back into its box. For a few weeks, I felt completely broken. But eventually, I realized something. My sister hadn't stolen my wedding. She had saved me from marrying a man who didn't deserve me, and she had exposed herself in the process. Months later, I moved to another city. I started over. I changed my job, made new friends, and slowly became happy again. As for Jessica and Daniel, they didn't end up together. Apparently, once the truth came out, they spent more time blaming each other than building the relationship they had planned. And me, I learned the most important lesson of my life. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying the people who hurt you. Sometimes revenge is simply letting the truth speak for itself and walking away with your dignity intact. Because the best revenge isn't making someone suffer. It's building a life they can no longer control. And that's exactly what I did.